Welcome and thank you for joining us today as we begin a new and exciting seminar series. I am Carlos Bosquez, CEO at the Food Allergy Science Initiative, or FASI, and I'm excited to welcome all of you today to today's seminar. Um, Today's seminar is sponsored by Genentech, and we're very thankful for your kind sponsorship. At FASI, our focus is to understand, translate, and intervene with food allergies. And as a leader of the food allergy research, FASI is dedicated to advancing breakthrough discoveries in research to transform the lives of people living with food allergies. While food allergies impact millions of people across the world, understanding the disease and the availability of effective treatments remain a limitation. This year, we have prepared an exciting seminar series titled The Allergy Equation: Clinical Trials Shaping the Future of Food Allergies. During the series, we will explore the advancements in clinical trials and provide helpful information about the development of therapeutics impacting the future of food allergy management. We put together an exciting lineup, as you can see here, and throughout the series, we will be joined by experts as they discuss the emerging therapies and examine the challenges and success in the recent clinical trials. Whether you're a patient, a parent, a clinician, a researcher, or just curious about food allergies, we hope this seminar series will provide helpful information to all of you. Before we begin, I would like to clarify that FASI is science-driven and evidence-based, and therefore, throughout the seminar series, our intent is to not to promote any products or any companies, but instead to inform our audience on recent clinical development efforts for food allergies, and also to have the opportunity to ask questions to better understand the benefits and the challenges of the different emerging options. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by CJ Beneduce, Principal Scientist at FASI, to help kick off this seminar series. CJ has over 10 years of experience in many areas of drug development, all the way from target identification and validation, antibody discovery, lead optimization, translational development, competitive landscape analysis, and many, many others. Before FASI, CJ was a scientist at Johnson & Johnson, where he contributed to multiple projects across the immunology portfolio. Some of CJ's previous work has focused on the discovery and translation of key immunological findings to engineer and develop novel therapies for autoimmune diseases. Now a principal scientist at FASI, CJ has brought his broad and deep expertise to guide and propel FASI's translation on drug discovery efforts. So we are very thankful to have you, CJ. Thank you for joining us today. Very excited to have this discussion with you. Before we start, I just want to remind our audience that we will take questions from the Q&A box, and we'll discuss this at the end of the presentation. But CJ, it is really an honor to have you here. I really enjoy every time we have the opportunity to talk about science, as you are an amazing scientist that really can expand all areas of research. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I appreciate it, Carlos. And yeah, it's very fun to talk science with you almost every day.
CJ, just for our audience to get to know you better, I always love to ask this question to everyone. You've actually done a lot of great things in autoimmune diseases that work across the industry. Why did you decide to join FASI?
That's a great question. I've been very fortunate in my career to work with experts from a variety of fields and myself kind of be inundated in a variety of fields. You mentioned obviously autoimmune disorders is where I think I spent most of my past. Fetal maternal medicine, fibrotic disorders, I even dabbled in cancer for a little while. And I think the reason why I was so excited to join FASI is mostly because I recognized that there's so much time, money and investment and energy into all these other fields. Yet when you look at food allergy, it doesn't feel like it has that same type of drive behind it. And so I think I was excited to join FASI because it looked like it was going to be an organization that could help usher in sort of the next generation of food therapy, food allergy therapies. And so, yeah, I was just excited at the opportunity.
Thank you. Well, we are fortunate to have you and and your contributions to this organization. Um, I know you have spent many years, especially when it comes to looking at the therapeutic landscape and the opportunities and options for treatments across other indications, like, for example, autoimmune diseases. Can you give our audience your perspective of how the therapeutic landscape compares when you think about autoimmune diseases versus food allergies?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a tricky question. I think you'll see why in a second. The first thing to point out is sort of the prevalence. Thinking about some of the more common disorders that we see out there, looking at the prevalence of things like cancer, autoimmune diseases, and food allergies to try to get an understanding of how many people out there are suffering from these. Cancer, about 2 million people, and this was a 2025 estimate, actually are living actively with cancer in the United States. Compare that with about 15 million people living with chronic autoimmune disorders. And food allergies are, depending on which publication you look at, this is a tricky number to truly nail down. About 26 million people in the US are living with some form of food allergies. I've seen numbers even as high as up to 35 million. I think some of the work from both Ruchi Gupta and Chris Warren at Northwestern have tried to really shed light on that number. It's a very tricky one to nail down. But kind of relative to what I was saying about why I joined FASI, I think this next point is why it's just interesting. You see so many people with food allergies, yet when you look at the number of drugs approved in the past decade, this is from 2014 to 2024, but over 150 drugs for cancer, about 48 drugs for autoimmune disorders, whereas there's only 2 drugs for food allergies. And that's a really surprising finding, considering how many people are truly suffering from this disease. And one more point I'll make too is not only are there only 2 drugs active, when you look at the total number of currently active clinical trials and use this as a way of understanding how much work is being done in the clinic for the disorders, over 14,000 clinical trials for cancer are on clinicaltrials.gov right now, compared to a little over 900 for autoimmune disorders and only 22 for food allergies. So you can really see this discrepancy between the number of people who are suffering and the actual development in this field.
Thank you. I'm always just really saddened and impressed by this fact, and I hope we can all help change this narrative. Um, so looking at this, you told us about the trials that, what has been approved in food allergies, what are the trials that are now, the number of trials that are ongoing. Um, you have looked at the entire landscape of food allergies and the activity. Can you, would love for you to educate our audience and tell them more about what has been approved, what is available, what is emerging, what will be approved soon, and what's in the pipeline, so that everyone, I know that this is a big part of what you do before really trying to solve an issue. It's important to look at the entire therapeutic landscape so that you're not reinventing the wheel. So I really appreciate that from the work you guys been doing. Can you help the audience learn about what's there and what's coming?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, there are only 2 approved therapies, FDA-approved therapies in the U.S. for food allergy. That includes both Palforzia, which is approved for peanut allergies in 2020, and then the most recent approval of Xolair, also known as omalizumab, in 2024. I think that a lot of the audience should be relatively familiar with these two, but very briefly, Palforzia, it sort of represents the first attempt to truly standardize oral immunotherapy, which is a very common technique used for hundreds of years to try and treat food allergies. Xolair, and we'll talk a little bit about this later on, and I know that we've had some seminars in the past on Xolair, is a monoclonal antibody injection that is used to almost act like a prophylaxis for food allergy. But there is still some exciting work going on with this even after the approval in 2024. So we'll talk about that. But as it stands, these are the only two therapies approved by the FDA. That being said, there are a variety of emergency medications that are currently available. The most well-known is probably the EpiPen auto-injector, which was approved back in 1987, and the first generics for this started showing up in 2018. The Auvi-Q was the next one that popped up in 2012. And then the most recent, and I think it's still exciting that we're seeing development in this field, was the approval of Neffy, which is an epinephrine nasal spray, and that was recently approved in 2024. One thing I'd like to point out too is if you'd like to learn more about these types of therapies, in particular Neffy, we do have a webinar coming up. I believe it's our next webinar from Serena Tanimoto. She is a physician and the chief medical officer at ARS Pharmaceuticals. She'll have a talk coming up talking about Neffy in the next couple weeks. Now, in terms of what's coming next, I think I maybe painted a bit of a dire picture, right? It seems like there's all this excitement and development in these other disorders, but this is why it's fun to dig into these questions and to really see what has been attempted and what's going on. Because when you start peeling back the layers, you see that there is still a good amount of development, and I think that the approval of Xolair is only going to amplify this and speed things up. So we're going to walk you through over the next couple minutes what I think is a relatively comprehensive picture of the food allergy landscape. And we're going to be using this heat map figure, which I'll walk you through. So in this heat map, the way that you can think of each of these rings, each ring would represent a stage of development. Now, going from preclinical development all the way down to approved therapies through phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. I'll populate this heat map with dots, and those dots correspond, the color of the dot corresponds to whether the program is active, it was discontinued, or sometimes they're in limbo. It's not entirely clear what the status of those programs are. And then finally, I kind of broke down this heat map into different categories, and I'll go deeper into each of these categories as we go through the talk. But in general, I tried to lump together a lot of these therapies into broad categories like tolerance, microbiome, cytokines, and like I said, we'll go deeper into those, but just to kind of give you an idea here. Starting off with the ones that we just briefly spoke about, the two FDA-approved therapies specifically for food allergy, Palforzia and Xolair, and I also included the emergency therapies for anaphylaxis, the EpiPen, the Auvi-Q, and Neffy. Now, like I said, I know we painted maybe a bit of a dire picture, but what's really exciting is that when you start to dig, when you start to peel back that onion, you see that there's a lot going on, and a lot of very early stuff and a lot of later stage stuff. And it's been really, really exciting to do this exercise, to see what's been attempted, to see what failed and why it failed and why people are maybe improving on those types of things. So what I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes or so is kind of do a little bit of a zoom into each of these categories to kind of give you some flavor for what's going on and what to look out for in the future. Before I do that deep dive, though, I do want to make two comments. And this is something that's always interesting, especially for those who are not familiar with the drug development process. To go from the outside of the circle, the initial conception of an idea, I found a target, all the way getting FDA approval, it's about 12 to 15 years. It's a very, very long journey. It can be shorter, it can even be longer, and it's very expensive. So I just wanted to show you this to kind of put things into context. So that's the first point I wanted to make. Second point I want to make is before the webinar, we got a lot of questions about, what are the new targets? I saw this news article about this and that. And I think I'm glad those articles come out because it generates excitement. And there are exciting findings coming out. I'm very quickly just going to point out two and to put them into context here. A lot of people asked about this particular publication. They're talking about work coming from Marco Colonna's lab. This is at the Washington University School of Medicine. They found that there are these certain cells that live in our guts that seem to be really important for the development of tolerance, the ability for us to eat things like peanuts and not have a reaction. So just once again, put into context, this is very exciting, but it's also very early. And so I'm going to talk about later stage stuff, but I want to point out that it's a very rich area of development. In addition, a lot of people have asked about this. Another paper that came from Talal Chatila's lab at Boston Children's Hospital. Also, very exciting research about a cytokine that might be playing a role in why people develop food allergies. And I think that these are two areas that I hope in the future to do another seminar and be able to talk through how they've gone through this development pipeline. Now, zooming back out, I'm going to go through each of these categories and give you some quick highlights and so that you guys can have maybe a better appreciation for what's going on. Starting with the emergency epinephrine therapies, as we know, there are the 3 approved here. There is actually still a good amount of clinical research going on. I think the 2 most advanced are these 2 drugs, Anafilm and this FXMIN002. Both of these are different ways of administering epinephrine that is not an intramuscular injection. I'll actually zoom in very briefly on Anafilm, which we're actually excited to see. I think there's going to be a potential approval for this one relatively soon. So Anafilm is an epinephrine sublingual film. So this is sort of an alternative to injections for emergency treatment of anaphylaxis. So what is it? It's a prodrug, and what that means, it's sort of like epinephrine, but it's a little different, and your body changes it into epinephrine. It's formulated in a way that you put it under your tongue, and what's great about this is that it can very quickly deliver epinephrine, and the hypothesis here is that this is more user-friendly than the injections, and it works just as fast. So they actually recently completed their final phase 3 trial, and we're expecting to see a launch of this product probably sometime in 2026. I want to direct your attention that sometime in May, we don't have a date nailed down quite yet, but David Golden, who is from Aquestive Therapeutics, will actually be giving a talk on Anafilm and sort of the future of this sublingual epinephrine. So zooming back out again, maybe jump into another category we're somewhat familiar with are the IgE or IgE modulating therapies, of which Xolair is the prototypical example. So in this field, there's a lot of development for IgE therapies. And these dots, remember, these are only things that are explicitly being developed for food allergies. I want to point out that there are a lot of IgE modulating therapies out there that might not be specifically for food allergies yet, but they will be at some point potentially in the future. But for now, each of these dots is representing ones that are specifically being developed for food allergy. One that you may have seen some news about, RPT 904. So you can think of this one as very similar to Xolair or omalizumab. The difference with RPT 904 is that it's something that you might be able to take and you don't have to dose it as frequently. And so you can imagine this like a longer lasting version of Xolair. I'm actually going to zoom in on Xolair here because I want to, let everybody know that there's some really exciting stuff happening, or we should be seeing over the next, year from Xolair, is the conclusion of these 2 major trials, the Outmatch trial and the Combine study. But first of all, just as a quick reminder, what is Xolair? Well, Xolair is an antibody. It's an injection that targets IgE, and those are the antibodies that are typically found in people with food allergies. And these antibodies are kind of what help trigger allergic reactions when we are exposed to an allergen. Xolair works by reducing reactions from those accidental exposures by pretty much neutralizing it, by blocking the activity of these IgE antibodies. So what's the status? So I really want to point out that the Outmatch study, which was actually the basis for the approval of Xolair and food allergy last year, so that was completed. But there are 2 other major stages of this trial, which are just about wrapped up right now. And there's some really exciting data that's coming out suggesting that omalizumab itself could be superior to immunotherapy. And that stage 3 in that light blue is investigating the very long-term effects. What happens if I stop taking Xolair? Can I go back to eating normally? What happens if I do oral immunotherapy after the fact? So really excited to see some of the data coming from that. One final study that actually was completed, but we're eagerly awaiting some of the data to be published, is the Combine study. This was a study that investigated both Xolair and Dupixent, and we'll talk about Dupixent a little later, combined with oral immunotherapy. And they were really excited to see how do these therapies work if combined with oral immunotherapy. Do they make it work better? Do they make it last longer? Do they induce so-called sustained unresponsiveness or just long-term effects? We're excited to be able to welcome FASI principal investigator Wayne Schreffler, who'll be joining us from Mass General Hospital. He is actually going to talk a little bit about these kind of combination therapies between Xolair and OIT. So I highly recommend we tune into that one. This will be coming up in February in the new year. Zooming back out again, we'll go into probably the final category that I think most people will be familiar with is the so-called immune tolerance. So when I say that, think of all the therapies that are like oral immunotherapy. Now, Palforzia is the only FDA-approved version of an oral immunotherapy specifically for peanut. But I think you can appreciate that this area has had a lot of development, a lot of failures as well, but quite a bit of development. And you get all these dots represent therapies that are trying to improve upon what Palforzia and oral immunotherapy do, whether it's a different formulation, a different dosing regimen, different combinations with other drugs. There's a lot of development in this space. I'll highlight a handful of them here. They're VLP-001. This is almost like a virus particle that has peanut proteins inside of it. There is another drug called Viaskin Peanut, which actually I will very briefly bring up. This is known as epicutaneous immunotherapy. So rather than eating the peanut proteins, epicutaneous immunotherapy is pretty much putting those peanut proteins on your skin and doing the immunotherapy like that. Highly recommend that you tune in for Edwin Kim's talk. He'll be joining us from the UNC School of Medicine. He was actually one of the authors on the recent publication on the Viaskin peanut patch. And so he'll be able to talk about how that therapy compares with standard oral immunotherapy. One that I will zoom in on, though, here is the PVX-108. What is this? So this is a peanut peptide immunotherapy, and I kind of consider it the next generation of immunotherapy. So what is it? This is just a subcutaneously administered peanut peptides. So when you think about OIT and oral immunotherapy, we're giving peanut powder or purified peanut proteins. This approach is a little bit different. Instead of giving the whole protein, it's giving little bits of it, these little peptides. So hypothetically, the idea here is that these peptides may actually lead to better and longer lasting effects than OIT alone. And they're potentially safer. So when you think about the effects that people sometimes suffer from when going through immunotherapy, because we're not giving that whole protein, that whole ball you can see on the left there, we're only giving the little peptides, it makes it safer. It makes it so that your body actually doesn't respond badly to those proteins, but it still works like OIT. So actually very recently completed a phase 1 trial in end of 2024, and they have a phase 2 trial underway with an expected readouts in late next year into early next year. So this is an exciting one to keep an eye on. One other category that I find very interesting, and you've seen some development in, is the microbiome modulation. It's been known for quite a while that the microbiome of people who suffer from food allergy, it looks distinct from those who don't suffer from food allergies. And this has spurred a lot of research into saying, what happens if I can reverse that? What if I can make a food allergic microbiome look more like a healthy microbiome? One of the more exciting things that I've seen recently is this trial of MTT, also known as microbial transplantation therapy. The idea behind this is that if I can change the microbiome while doing immunotherapy, it might lead to longer lasting effects. So what actually is this therapy? It's a purified fecal microbiome. These are from screened donors, and you combine this with peanut oral immunotherapy. Hypothetically, the idea, or based on some of the data we've seen, what's happening is you're changing the gut microbiome by introducing these new microbes. And that change somehow might lead to longer and better and more durable responses when you pair it with immunotherapy. So these studies are actually being run by Rima Rashid. She's from Boston Children's Hospital. And some of the initial studies from her phase 2 part A actually demonstrated the ability of a single course of this MTT therapy to actually increase the dose of tolerated peanut. So the phase 2 part B study, which is in part supported by funding from FASI, is going to investigate now what happens if you combine this therapy with oral immunotherapy for peanut. So keep an eye out for this one. And then I'm going to quickly flash through these last couple categories to wrap it up, and then we'll kind of finish off on a timeline here. So there's a few other areas that I had mentioned at the beginning. Allergen neutralization is one of them. There are two right now in the context of food allergy therapies out there. One of them is called IGNX001. This is from a company called IGGenics. So you can think of this as something similar to Xolair in the sense that it's blocking the activity of antibodies. But in the context of this one, it's like a prophylactic that specifically blocks peanut reactions. So if I'm accidentally exposed to a peanut, this drug will essentially bind the peanut and prevent it from causing an allergic reaction. There's another very broad category, which I've labeled immunomodulation. So you can think of these things that are broadly, very, very broadly hitting multiple parts of the immune system to try and limit an allergic reaction. There's quite a bit of work going on in this field, but I'll just very briefly point out two of these. I'll start with Imbruvica. So interesting thing, Imbruvica is approved for a variety of lymphomas and leukemias. And you'll see a trend here that a lot of medications from autoimmune and cancer indications are being repurposed for food allergy. Imbruvica was actually tested in a food allergy trial and was shown to limit the reaction in peanut allergic patients when they were challenged with peanuts after only 2 days of dosing. I'll talk a little bit more about linvoseltamab in just a moment, but this is another very recently approved therapy for multiple myeloma that's being investigated in food allergy. And then the final category, so-called cytokines and mediators. Think of this as a category of things that are spit out by our immune system, small proteins that have very pleiotropic, or they hit a lot of different cells in our body, and they can help trigger or exacerbate allergic reactions. A little bit of development in this area, but I think the two most well-known therapies here are known as Tezspire and Dupixent or dupilumab. Tezspire is currently being investigated in a phase 2 trial when combined with oral immunotherapy. And Dupixent, which maybe a lot of you are aware of, is a drug that's been used for atopic dermatitis for quite a long time, and it's being actively investigated in food allergy. And I'm going to do my last little zoom here on a very interesting trial that's ongoing right now, which is a combination between one of those immunomodulators and one of those inhibitors of cytokines. So the concept behind this combination is that we can reset the immune system in a way to reverse allergies. So what is it? This is a combination between linvoseltamab. This is a bispecific antibody. It means this is an antibody therapy that binds two different targets, and Dupixent, which targets a receptor that is involved in allergic reactions. So to show you how this works, I actually wanted to pull up some cool data from a relatively recent paper that looked at this combination. So I'll show you here, this is a primate study. On the y-axis, you can see serum IgE. So think of this as just the amount of IgE in the blood. So in an untreated primate, you see that the IgE levels, they stay pretty standard. So linvoseltamab, what it does is it actually depletes the cells that make IgE. So I think you can see that on the first day of the study, when you inject linvoseltamab, our IgE levels drop, but they slowly come back up. It's because those B cells just repopulate. But if you combine linvoseltamab with Dupixent, what Dupixent does, it prevents new B cells from ever being able to make IgE in the future. So you can see that with the combination, the IgE levels stay low. So this formed the basis for why Regeneron is going into the clinic with this combination. There is currently a phase 2 trial underway with a readout expected sometime in early 2026. So very excited to see the results of this one. One final point I'll make is that Jennifer Maloney will be giving a talk on dupilumab on Tuesday, April 7th. So tune in for that one. And so to kind of round it all out and zoom back out once again for the full picture, here is we think is probably one of the more comprehensive pipelines of food allergy. And I hope that you guys enjoyed a little bit of the deep dive here. Obviously, we can't show you absolutely everything, but we wanted to give you a little highlight of some of the more exciting developments.
Thank you, CJ. This is wonderful. This is wonderful and great to see it all tied up like this. I think a lot of people may be more familiar with things that are emerging right now, but just always good to go back to other stages of clinical development. CJ, I think in summary for parents of food allergic or people with food allergies, if you were to summarize what dates and what timelines should they be paying attention to, what would that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously there's a lot of dots on this circle, and not everything is actively in development. But to help put things into context, I did prepare a little timeline. No, this is not comprehensive. This is not showing every drug that's in clinical development, but some of the ones that we think are going to be coming up soon, or ones that are starting soon. So broken down by those categories, you can see some of those drugs or combinations of drugs listed here, as well as where they are in their clinical development. And I'll give you a little highlight here of when you expect these trials to either start or read out. We are currently right about that red line right here, and each of these bars represents pretty much the timeline or the expected timeline for those clinical trials. And you can see that some of these are going to be reading out very soon. You can see in the immune tolerance space, as well as microbiome modulation. We're expecting to see some stuff within the next 6 months. And there are some exciting trials that are starting right now, particularly the bottom one, Tezspire, when combined with oral immunotherapy, or this other immune tolerizing therapy known as ENP501. So yeah, a lot of exciting stuff to look forward to. And like I said, I really hope that we can kind of keep these updates going, because the pace of the data is quick and things are changing rapidly. But I hope that this is a good overview for everyone.
Outstanding. Very, very helpful. CJ, thank you for coming today and really providing us, all of us and the audience, information about this critical topic. Very informative. Before we move into the Q&A session, I always get the question, how can you help? Donate, host an event, follow us on social media, and join our next webinar. As CJ mentioned, our next seminar would be actually by the chief medical officers of ARS Pharma, who are developing neffy, and Dr. Serena Tanimoto will actually provide information about neffy and the recent approval by ARS. So don't miss that seminar. Um, Moving into Q&A, we have about 15 minutes of questions and answers, and I have a few good questions here from Marion. Actually, is there a hope for a future non-injectable version of Xolair?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'll do another plug for Wayne Trefler, who's going to be giving a talk relatively soon. So it's become very much part of the natural progression for the majority of biologics. So think of drugs that we get an injection for, to go from being something that is sort of an intravenous injection to a subcutaneous injection. So I think the answer is yes. There is definitely a non-injectable version. I don't think it will be Xolair in particular, but there'll likely be a drug in the future that does something like Xolair that could be, taken like a pill. We're not there yet, but that is a very natural progression for the research to try and go from injections to something that is orally available.
Thank you, CJ. One good question here from Jimena. Low number of studies. Is it really in comparison, I guess, to other indications, right? Limitations. What are the limitations specifically? Is it low interest? Is it length of the studies, lack of money, and what can people do to promote them?
It's a great question, and I'm afraid there isn't exactly an easy answer for that one. And it's a combination, I think, of all of those reasons. I know I showed you that stark contrast between how many people have the disease, how few drugs there are, and how few trials there are. But maybe just to touch on very high level points would be that, yeah, these are expensive trials to run. All trials are expensive to run, but in particular, food allergy trials can be very tricky, and a lot of that has to do with the readout. So, a lot of parents, especially of young children who go into these trials, they have to receive a double-blind, placebo-controlled food challenge. So it's very expensive to actually do that in the clinic, but it also is something that most people don't want to subject themselves to. So you have this combination of a very expensive procedure as a readout, And you have patients who don't want to go through that. And I don't blame them. It's a very difficult experience to go through. I think hopefully in the future we have better ways of reading out trials that don't involve an oral food challenge. And that might increase the amount of people who are willing to sign up for these trials. One other point I'll make too is, yeah, I think that the cost overall, but also I think we're getting to a point where finally the word is out. I think that's kind of the basis for FASI and a lot of other organizations in this space to get the word out that food allergy is a major issue and is something that is worth investing in. So I think the approval of Xolair really has been a monumental thing that's going to propel the field forward. So hopefully we see that number of trials trickle up a little bit, irrespective of the fact that they still cost a lot and that they're difficult to recruit for.
Excellent. A lot of great questions here. This one may be a tricky one. Which therapy or type of therapy is expected to be safest? Meaning which would have lowest side effects?
That, yeah, also a tricky question, but a very good one. And maybe I'll put a little bit of context here. So Xolair, once again, the most recently approved. Xolair is an incredibly safe drug. It's been used for over 20 years, I think at this point, or close to 20 years. And it has an incredibly safe, good safety profile. So any new drug that gets developed in this space always, in a lot of ways, needs to compare itself to Xolair because of how safe it is. But I do think that, in terms of what will be the safest, and I don't want to give you guys a specific drug because, like I said, some of these are very early. We don't have data yet. But I could say that in general, a lot of the therapies that will try to behave like Xolair or improve upon what Xolair does will probably be some of the safer ones. And I do think that, as we know, oral immunotherapy comes with its risks. Palforzia attempted to standardize that so that there is less risk. But I do think that a lot of the therapies in that immune modulation space, or I'm sorry, in the immune tolerance space, are designed to make the process of immunotherapy safer. And I think I did give that one example of Aravax, the PVX-108, those peptides. I think that's a good example of maybe a therapy that might be safer than what's currently available.
Thank you, CJ. And yeah, with safety, it's a challenging thing just to remind everyone, right? Even some of the safest drugs, there's some that have black box warnings. We know that Xolair doesn't work for everyone. It's exciting in comparison to many others, but there's still also some limitations on that,
Yes.
and it's important that everyone check with your clinician, get your guidance directly from your physician as it applies to your particular case. Um, uh, Incidents. Let me see. There's a lot of good stuff here. Maybe I'll take about two or three more. Do we know the incidence rate for food allergies in different continents around the world? Any thoughts on that at a high level?
Yeah, another excellent question. And I'll plug again, I think I mentioned them before. So both Doctors Chris Warren and Dr. Ruchi Gupta, they're epidemiologists at Northwestern. And I think that in the field, they're the preeminent epidemiologists when it comes to food allergy research. And they have published some really nice stuff on this exact question about the worldwide prevalence. So the short answer is yes. There obviously is allergies across the globe. The prevalence of those allergies definitely can differ by continent and by country, and by the type of allergy. So you might have more peanut allergy in one country versus another country which has no peanut allergy. There's a lot of diversity. But allergy exists on almost every continent on the face of the earth in some form or another. And I think that the epidemiology research is important because it helps us not only understand who has allergy, but also potentially why they have allergies. Is it something about the diets of those countries? Is it something about the way that foods are introduced? So these are the types of questions that can get answered by that sort of research.
Um, You talk about the time frame from the beginning to approval of a drug development trajectory. One question here is in the timeline from an average time frame from a clinical trial
Hmm.
for a therapy to an actual reaching the public. Can you give a better perspective of the timeline from clinical trials to reaching the public?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I'll kind of two-part this one a little bit because the length of the trial is very much determined by obviously what the therapy is attempting to do, and kind of what is the realistic time frame to get an answer on did the person respond or not. So maybe I'll use once again Xolair as an example. So the trial that got Xolair approved in food allergy. So these are relatively short in the sense that you can give Xolair for a relatively short period of time, a couple months, and then you can do a food challenge. And your readout is instantaneous. So you can pretty much tell whether or not somebody responded by that food challenge. Think of the opposite side of the spectrum as something like immunotherapy or any of the immunotherapy like therapies that we talked about. Those take a very long time because now you're thinking, okay, well, I give you my drug and I have to wait a year, 2 years or more to see did it work and then did it last. So it really kind of, a lot that question really comes down to what type of therapy and then what type of readout am I looking for. So I know that's maybe not the most satisfying answer, but they can be as short as 6 months, they can be as long as 5 years. It really depends. But I think in that circle diagram, there's a mix. There are things that will read out quicker, and there are things that are going to take a much longer period of time.
There's I'll probably do two more questions, two or three more questions, CJ. But the I think some people are reacting to the article that just came up yesterday
Mhm.
on the study by Chubb, where they show that after the LEAP trial and the movement into early introduction of peanuts, that there was a decrease. I believe it was from like 1.4% to about 0.98%. And so. In the incidence of food allergies for people with peanut. I guess the question is, are you seeing that as real? What is your opinion about that new emerging data?
Yeah, I mean, it's very exciting. I think that, there's been so many clinical trials. The LEAP study, I think, is probably the biggest one that people should look up, showing that early introduction does work. Once again, please speak to your allergists about this type of stuff. But pointing out what I see in the literature, that the data suggests that early introduction of allergenic foods does seem to correlate with longer term tolerance to those foods, not developing allergies in the first place. So, you remember what happened is, I think it was 27 or 2018 where the FDA came out and actually started to promote early introduction. And so that publication that's being referenced is the first time that we've actually been able to now look at the data and say, hey, at a broad scale, a population level scale, did that recommendation of early introduction work? And I think that the answer is yes. It clearly does seem to be working in the real world and not just in a controlled clinical environment. And maybe one other point I'll make here too is there are a lot of therapies in that circle diagram that are trying to look at the prevention of food allergy before they even start. And so particularly some of those microbiome therapies are kind of asking the question of, can I make the microbiome look its best, look the closest to a healthy person, and do that before somebody develops allergy in the first place? So some very interesting studies going on in like I said, the preventative, let's call it, setting for food allergies.
Yeah, no, it's a great. I was excited to see that publication and the fact that LEAP trial was a landmark study and moving in the right direction. I believe they calculated it would impact about 1 per 200 children if they have early introduction of reducing the probability of developing food allergies. So anything that moves in the right direction would be very valuable. Um, to close with the last question, what's missing? There's a lot there in a very brief, we have little time, but what's missing?
I think there's probably a lot missing. I think there are so many different avenues in which there could be more investment, more research. But I think if I had to really kind of put a couple things down, and this is related to the questions about the clinical trials, new types of readouts. Because if you can make it easier to run clinical trials and have easy readouts that are not onerous for the patients, all that's going to do is really help get new therapies off the ground. It's going to help recruit for trials. It's going to help get people excited about participating in these trials. So I think that new readouts other than food challenge is definitely one big thing that's missing. And there's a lot on the horizon. maybe one thing on the therapeutic side is, yeah, I think just we need more things that are allergen agnostic. And I think that the one of those areas, the immune tolerance, with all those dots, the majority of those are only for a single allergen. We definitely want or should develop therapies that work for any allergy. I think that's going to be a very important thing for the future because most people have more than one allergy. Very rarely do you just have peanut allergy. It's combined with other nuts. So, I think it's important to think beyond the allergen specific and then move into the so-called allergen agnostic therapies.
Wonderful. Perfect timing. CJ, thank you for spending the time and educating all of us about the landscape, therapeutic landscape, the needs, and hopefully in a few years from now, we'll be able to have another meeting like this and have a lot of the green dots right in the approval stage, and a lot of therapeutic options for
Mhm.
people. As we know in many other indications, it's not, there's typically never a silver bullet of something that solves everything, but having opportunities for the wide variety of people with different presentations and endotypes and manifestations of food allergies can be solved with more efforts in this area. So thank you everyone for joining us again. We're looking forward to an exciting seminar series over the next 10 months. We hope that you can all continue to join us for these discussions and love to get the questions. We will obviously follow up if your questions were not addressed. Let's make sure we follow up offline. But thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.